Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The first time I died was on a Tuesday in March, though I wouldn't understand what that meant until much later. The second time was yesterday. The third time will be in about an hour when I finish recording this account. My name is Dr. Keiran Holt, and I'm speaking to you from what remains of the research vessel Celestia, drifting somewhere in the void beyond Pluto's orbit. If you're hearing this, then somehow my final transmission broke through whatever barrier has been containing us out here. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but I need you to understand what happened to my crew, what happened to me, and why you must never, under any circumstances, approach the moon designated Y94. I was 37 when we launched, an astrophysicist running from the ghosts of a failed Mars mission that had cost 3 lives due to my miscalculations. The Celestia was supposed to be my redemption, a chance to contribute something meaningful to human knowledge while studying the mysteries of our solar system's outer reaches. The irony isn't lost on me now that my search for redemption led to something far worse than anything I'd left behind on Earth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the morning. Everything changed, because that's when the universe first showed me its teeth. Our crew numbered 6 when we began our year-long mission orbiting Y94, a barren moon that official surveys had dismissed as lifeless and unremarkable. Captain Elena Torres commanded the vessel with the steady competence of someone who'd spent decades in deep space. Dr. Marcus Lennox served as our geologist, a man whose enthusiasm for discovery would ultimately doom him. Patricia Wells kept our systems running as chief engineer, while Dr. Sierra Collins maintained our health as medical officer. Diana Yamamoto handled all communications with Earth, though the signal delay made real-time conversation impossible at our distance. And then there was me, the systems analyst and astrophysicist, spending my days scanning empty space and barren rock, trying to find something, anything, that might justify the enormous expense of our mission. The first sign came during what should have been a routine morning scan. I was alone in my laboratory, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee while reviewing spectral analysis readings from Y94's surface. The taste was bitter, metallic. Our recycled water always carried that tang after months in space. Outside the porthole, the moon hung like a grey eye against the star field, watching us with the patience of something that had been waiting for eons. That's when my instruments began responding to something that defied every law of physics I knew. The electromagnetic sensors registered fluctuations that shouldn't exist, wavelengths that occupied spaces between known frequencies like colours that had no names. But more disturbing than the readings themselves was how they affected my equipment. Hard drives began corrupting in real time, their metal casings remaining perfectly intact, while the information stored within transformed into something that hurt to read. The corruption wasn't random, it followed patterns that made my eyes water and my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Optical sensors produced imagery that changed when I wasn't looking directly at the screens. I would glance away for a moment, and when I turned back, the same landscape would be photographed from impossible angles, as if the camera had somehow moved to a position that couldn't exist in 3-dimensional space. I spent 3 days trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Equipment failure seemed the most logical explanation, but diagnostic tests revealed all systems functioning within normal parameters. The anomaly only manifested when scanning one specific location on Y94's surface, grid reference 77 Alpha in the northern polar region. On the fourth day, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. The corruption wasn't just affecting new data, it was retroactively altering files I'd created weeks earlier. Research notes I'd written in my own handwriting now contained observations I'd never made, using vocabulary I didn't recognize. The changes were subtle but unmistakable, as if something was editing my past to make room for a future I hadn't yet lived. The distortion wasn't random. It followed patterns that existed at the edge of comprehension, affecting only information while leaving matter completely untouched. It was as if something was interfering with the very concept of knowledge, corrupting understanding itself rather than the physical systems that contained it. I should have kept my discovery to herself, should have quietly filed a report about equipment malfunctions and requested a return to Earth. Instead, my scientific curiosity overruled every survival instinct I possessed, and I brought my findings to Captain Torres. The emergency meeting was held in our conference room, a cramped space that suddenly felt even smaller as our 6-person crew gathered around the central display. The air recycling system hummed louder than usual, as if the ship itself was nervous about what we were discussing. "Look at these readings," I said, highlighting the electromagnetic distortions on the main screen. "This isn't equipment failure. The patterns are too consistent, too deliberately targeted. Something on Y94's surface is generating effects that shouldn't be possible, according to our current understanding of physics." Dr. Lennox leaned forward, his weathered face animated with the kind of excitement I'd seen in children discovering something wonderful and terrible. In his 50s, he'd spent his career studying dead worlds, searching for clues about planetary formation and early solar system history. The possibility of discovering something unprecedented clearly thrilled him in ways that should have worried me. "The geological surveys showed nothing unusual about that region," he said, studying the surface coordinates with growing enthusiasm. "Standard igneous rock formation, no mineral deposits of significant interest. If there's something there generating these effects, then we're looking at the discovery of the century." "Or the disaster of the century," Patricia Wells interjected, ever the pragmatist. She'd been staring at my data with the expression she usually reserved for critical system failures. "Keiran's been working 18-hour shifts for weeks. We're dealing with equipment that's been in space for 8 months, subjected to cosmic radiation and micrometeor impacts. Maybe we should consider more mundane explanations before jumping to conclusions about revolutionary physics." But I knew she was wrong, though I couldn't explain how I knew with such certainty. "It's not equipment failure, Patricia. It's not even alien technology in any conventional sense. It's something else entirely. Something that doesn't interact with matter the way we expect." Dr. Collins, our medical officer, had been studying the visual displays with the analytical eye she usually reserved for diagnostic imagery. "These distortion patterns," she said slowly, her voice carrying a note of unease. "They're not random. There's an underlying structure that reminds me of neural networks, like brain activity patterns, but far more complex than anything biological should be capable of producing." She was right, though I hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. The patterns did resemble neural activity, but scaled up to dimensions that suggested a mind operating on principles beyond human comprehension. Diana Yamamoto had been quietly reviewing the technical specifications of our scanning equipment. "If we're going to investigate this properly," she said, "we'll need to establish comprehensive baseline readings. I can recalibrate our communications array to monitor for any changes in the distortion field while a team is on the surface." The debate continued for another 2 hours, growing more heated as the implications of our discovery became clear. Wells argued for immediate return to Earth, citing safety protocols and the potentially dangerous nature of the phenomenon. Lennox pushed for aggressive investigation, convinced we were on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize human understanding of the universe. Torres, listen to all perspectives with the patience of someone who'd made life and death decisions before, but I could see the curiosity building in her eyes. "We go down," she announced, with the finality that had made her an effective commander for over 2 decades. "Minimum risk, maximum information gathering. Keiran, you're essential since you discovered and have been tracking the anomaly. Lennox, I want your geological expertise on site. I'll pilot the descent vehicle myself." I felt a chill at her words that had nothing to do with the ship's climate control. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming warnings that I chose to ignore in favor of scientific curiosity. The human drive to understand, to explore, to push beyond known boundaries. It's one of our species' greatest strengths, and as I would learn, sometimes our most fatal weakness. That night, I experienced the first of what I would later recognize as prophetic dreams. I found myself falling through endless darkness, past walls that stretched into infinity. The walls were covered with intricate carvings that shifted and changed as I watched, forming patterns that conveyed meaning without using any recognizable language. The information they contained bypassed my conscious mind entirely, speaking directly to some deeper part of my brain that understood concepts my waking mind couldn't grasp. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth, and the absolute certainty that something vast and ancient was waiting for us beneath Y-94's surface, something that had been patient for longer than human civilization had existed, but was now stirring with anticipation as we prepared to disturb its rest. Preparation for the surface mission took 2 days. We reviewed every safety protocol multiple times, tested all equipment until Torres was satisfied with its performance, and established detailed communication schedules with the team remaining aboard the Celestia. I should have paid more attention to the subtle changes occurring around me. During those preparations, the way shadows seemed to linger in corners longer than they should, the occasional glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned to look directly. The descent shuttle detached from the Celestia on a Friday morning, local ship time. Through the viewports, Y-94 appeared as a grey, lifeless sphere, its surface unmarked by any signs of geological activity or atmospheric weathering. But as we approached the landing coordinates, I began experiencing sensations I'd never felt before, and pray I'll never feel again. A pressure built behind my eyes, not quite painful but profoundly uncomfortable, like someone pressing thumbs against my skull from the inside. My hearing seemed to fluctuate randomly, sounds becoming muffled and distant before snapping back to normal clarity without warning. Most disturbing of all, I began hearing my own voice echoing softly in my ears, even when I wasn't speaking. The words were indistinct at first, like a delayed playback of conversations I couldn't remember having, but as we descended through Y-94's thin atmosphere, the voice became clearer, and I realized with growing horror that I was hearing myself describe events that hadn't yet occurred. My own voice was narrating our landing, our discovery, our fates, using words I hadn't yet spoken, but somehow already knew. "You feeling all right, Keiran?" Torres asked as she piloted us through the final approach. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just pre-mission nerves," I lied, though the sensations were intensifying with every meter we descended. The voice in my ears was growing more distinct, and I could make out complete sentences now. Technical specifications I hadn't yet recorded, observations of things I hadn't yet seen, descriptions of discoveries that would change everything I thought I knew about reality. The shuttle touched down on terrain that defied all my expectations. The surface wasn't rough or pockmarked like most airless worlds, but smooth and polished to an almost mirror finish. Our boots made no sound as we stepped onto the surface, not just because of the lack of atmosphere, but because the material beneath our feet seemed to absorb vibrations rather than transmit them. "This is remarkable," Lennox breathed over the comm system, kneeling to examine the ground beneath our feet. "I've never seen natural rock formation this uniform. It's like the entire surface has been processed by some kind of industrial technique, polished to molecular smoothness. The distortion source lay 300 meters from our landing site, according to my portable scanner. As we approached, the pressure behind my eyes intensified, and the voice in my ears became clearer than my own thoughts. I was hearing myself describe our approach before we made it, predicting our reactions before we had them, narrating our doom before we sealed it. "There," Torres said, pointing toward what appeared to be a natural depression in the landscape ahead, but as we crested a low rise and got our first clear view of the site, I realized it wasn't a depression at all. It was a perfectly circular opening in the ground, perhaps 20 meters across, descending into absolute darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Our helmet beams disappeared into that blackness without illuminating anything below, as if the opening existed in a space where photons simply ceased to function. The perfection of the circle was unsettling in ways I couldn't articulate. Every curve was mathematically precise, every edge cut with a sharpness that hurt to observe directly. It looked less like a natural formation and more like a precisely engineered interface designed for purposes I couldn't begin to guess. "How deep does it go?" Lennox asked, approaching the edge with the fearless curiosity that would ultimately kill him. I activated our most sophisticated portable sonar unit, a device capable of mapping underground structures to depths of several kilometers. The readings it returned violated everything I thought I knew about acoustics and geology. The signal appeared to travel downward indefinitely without ever encountering a surface to reflect from. According to the instrument, the opening had no bottom. It was a hole that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. "That's impossible," Torres muttered, checking our equipment for malfunctions that she wouldn't find. "Every cavity has to terminate eventually. Basic physics demands it." But as I stared into that perfect circle of darkness, I knew we weren't dealing with basic physics anymore. We had stepped outside the comfortable boundaries of known science and into a realm where the universe operated according to rules that human minds weren't designed to understand. The voice in my ears was speaking more clearly now, my own words describing what we were seeing before I consciously observed it. I was hearing myself narrate events that were happening in real time, as if some part of me existed slightly ahead of the present moment, reporting back from a future that was already determined. Torres deployed our longest cable probe, a device designed to map deep surface features and collect samples from inaccessible locations. We watched the readout as it descended 50 meters, then 100, then 300. The cable played out smoothly, encountering no resistance or obstacles, transmitting normal telemetry data as it descended into the void. At 500 meters, everything changed in a way that redefined my understanding of change itself. The cable went completely slack, though the readout showed it hadn't encountered any surface or obstacle. The tension sensors registered 0 resistance, as if the probe had suddenly entered a space where gravity, mass, and physical laws ceased to have meaning. But more disturbing than the readings themselves was what I saw in my peripheral vision as I monitored the equipment. For just a moment, I glimpsed something impossible. The cable wasn't just hanging in empty space. It was extending into dimensions that shouldn't exist, stretching away from our three-dimensional reality into directions that had no names. I saw it connecting to structures that occupied the same coordinates as empty air, touching surfaces that existed in the spaces between atoms. "This makes no sense," Torres said, reviewing the instrument readings with growing concern. "The cable shows no weight, no downward pull. It's like it's hanging in a perfect vacuum, but there's nowhere for it to go except down." Lennox was studying the opening with the expression of a man who had found something he'd been searching for his entire life. "I need to see what's down there," he announced, with the certainty of someone whose fate had already been decided. "Just to the point where the probe went slack. If there's some kind of cavern system or underground structure, we need to document it properly." I should have objected immediately. Every instinct I possessed was screaming that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something dangerous in ways we couldn't comprehend. But the voice in my ears was already describing Lennox's descent, using my own words to narrate events that hadn't yet occurred, but were somehow inevitable. "Absolutely not," Torres said firmly, though I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. "We're not risking personnel until we have a better understanding of what we're dealing with." But Lennox was already suiting up with our emergency repelling equipment, his enthusiasm overriding all safety protocols and rational thought. "Just a quick reconnaissance," he insisted, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that precedes disaster. "I'll maintain constant radio contact and you can pull me up at the first sign of trouble." Against every regulation and safety protocol we'd established, against every instinct that should have kept us alive, Torres eventually agreed to let him make a limited descent. The decision was influenced by the readings from our probe, which continued to function normally despite being suspended in what appeared to be empty space 500 meters below the surface. I watched as Lennox clipped into the descent harness and began lowering himself into that perfect circle of darkness. His helmet lights disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the opening, as if light itself was being consumed, rather than simply absorbed. For the first 100 meters, everything proceeded normally. Lennox's voice crackled through our comm system, describing smooth walls that surrounded him, composed of the same polished material we'd observed on the surface. His readings showed normal atmospheric conditions within the opening, though that made no sense given Y-94's complete lack of atmosphere. "This is incredible," his voice came through the radio, distorted by distance and something else that made my skin crawl. "The walls are perfectly smooth, like they were machined by technology far beyond anything we've developed. I'm not seeing any natural formation patterns, no sedimentary layers or crystalline structures. It's like this opening was carved out of solid rock by something with impossible precision." At 200 meters, he reported that the walls were beginning to curve slightly, as if the vertical shaft was gradually becoming a tunnel that led away from the surface at an angle that hurt to think about. The temperature readings from his suit showed a gradual warming as he descended, which made no sense given that we were on an airless world with no internal heat source. "I'm approaching the 400-meter mark," Lennox reported, his voice carrying a note of awe that made me want to recall him immediately. "The curvature is becoming more pronounced. It's like I'm entering a horizontal passage now, though I can't see where it leads. The walls are starting to show some kind of texture, geometric patterns that repeat in ways that make my eyes hurt to follow. At exactly 500 meters, the point where our cable probe had gone slack, everything changed in a way that redefined everything." Lennox's voice cut off mid-sentence, not gradually, not with the crackling distortion of a failing radio, but instantly and completely, as if he had simply ceased to exist. The tether line, which had been playing out steadily as he descended, suddenly stopped moving. But there was no weight on it, no indication that anything was attached to the other end. "Lennox, respond," Torres called into her radio, a voice tight with controlled panic that was about to become uncontrolled terror. "Lennox, do you copy?" Silence, not just the absence of Lennox's voice, but a quality of silence that seemed to actively suppress sound, as if the universe itself had decided that certain things should not be heard. We waited 5 minutes, then 10, calling his name repeatedly and receiving no response. The tether line remained motionless, showing no tension or movement. It was as if Lennox had simply ceased to exist at the 500-meter mark, leaving behind only empty cable extending into nothingness that was somehow more than nothing. Torres activated the emergency retrieval system, hauling up the tether as quickly as our equipment allowed. I watched the counter climb, 400 meters, 300, 200. my heart pounding with a rhythm that seemed to match something vast and patient stirring in the depths below us. When the end of the tether emerged from the darkness, we stared in horrified disbelief at something that shouldn't have been possible. The heavy-duty cable had been severed, cut so cleanly it looked like it had been sliced by a molecular blade, guided by intelligence that understood matter at the quantum level. The cut was perfectly perpendicular to the cable's length, with no fraying or tearing that would indicate mechanical failure or stress. But it wasn't just cut. Looking at the severed end through my helmet's magnification, I could see that the individual strands of the cable had been separated at different points, creating a pattern that was definitely not random. The pattern resembled something I'd seen before but couldn't place, until I realized it matched the geometric textures Lennox had described seeing on the walls during his descent. There was no sign of Lennox himself, no pieces of his equipment, no fragments of his suit, no indication of what had happened to him. He had simply vanished at the exact point where our probe had encountered whatever impossibility existed, 500 meters below the surface. The return journey to the Celestia passed in stunned silence. Torres piloted us back to the ship with grim efficiency, while I tried to process what we'd witnessed. The voice in my ears had fallen silent, no longer providing its disturbing preview of coming events. But the pressure behind my eyes remained, and I found myself staring at the viewports, expecting to see something that wasn't there but somehow should have been. Back aboard the ship, I threw myself into analysing every piece of data we'd collected during the surface mission. I needed to understand what had happened to Lennox, needed to find some rational explanation that would let me sleep without seeing that perfect circle of darkness every time I closed my eyes. I reviewed sensor logs, atmospheric readings, gravitational measurements, and electromagnetic spectra, searching for some clue that would make sense of the impossible. The scientific method demanded logical analysis, but every finding led me further from rational understanding and closer to truths that human minds weren't designed to contain. The gravitational readings were particularly disturbing. At the surface level, Y-94's gravity behaved exactly as expected based on the moon's mass and composition, but as our probes descended into the opening, they encountered gravitational fields that followed no known physics. At certain depths, gravity appeared to reverse direction entirely. At others, it seemed to pull sideways, or inward, toward the center of the shaft, or in directions that didn't correspond to any spatial orientation I could visualize. But the most unsettling discovery was what the gravitational sensors had detected at the 500-meter mark. For just a moment, as our probe crossed that threshold, the readings had spiked to show gravitational forces that shouldn't exist anywhere in the known universe. The probe had briefly experienced the gravitational pull of something with the mass of a star, compressed into a space smaller than an atom. I was so absorbed in my analysis that I didn't initially notice the gaps in my memory. I would sit down at my workstation after dinner, intending to spend a few hours reviewing data, only to find myself waking up slumped over my desk with no recollection of the intervening time. The chronometer would show that 8 or 10 hours had passed, but those hours had simply vanished from my experience as completely as Lennox had vanished into the void. During these lost periods, I apparently continued working. My computer logs showed activity throughout the night. Files opened and modified, notes added to my research journal, calculations performed with mathematical precision that exceeded my normal capabilities. But I had no memory of performing any of these tasks. It was as if someone else had been using my body while my mind was elsewhere. Or perhaps my mind had been elsewhere while someone else operated my body. The notes I found were written in my own handwriting, but they described observations and theories I didn't remember formulating. According to these mysterious entries, the opening on Y-94's surface wasn't a natural formation, but some kind of interface point, a place where normal space connected to something vastly different. The notes referred to concepts that existed at the edge of my understanding: dimensional boundaries, spatial folding, the intersection of incompatible geometries. Most disturbing of all, the notes contained detailed descriptions of events that hadn't yet occurred. They described conversations I hadn't had, crew deaths that hadn't happened, discoveries I hadn't made. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the content felt like reading someone else's memories of a future I hadn't lived. One entry particularly chilled me. Written in my own careful script, it read, "The entity doesn't exist in our space but uses our awareness as an anchor point. Each time we think about it, remember it, try to understand it, we strengthen the bridge between dimensions." Lennox wasn't killed, he was translated. His matter was converted to information and stored in a space that exists between our 3 dimensions and something larger. He's still conscious but can't return because his awareness now exists in a framework our reality can't contain. I had no memory of writing those words, but as I read them, they felt true in a way that made my hands shake and my vision blur. It was during one of these marathon research sessions that the voices began, and when they started, I realized that the silence since our return from Y-94 had been more ominous than any sound could be. At first, they seemed to come from within the ship's walls, muffled conversations in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. The words were indistinct, but the cadence was unmistakably human. The rise and fall of normal speech, interrupted by pauses and responses that suggested dialogue between multiple speakers discussing things that shouldn't exist. I would press my ear to the bulkheads, trying to locate the source of these phantom conversations. The voices would stop immediately when I did this, only to resume when I moved away. They seemed to be aware of my presence, responding to my actions, even though I couldn't identify where they were coming from or who was speaking. The conversations were always just barely audible, existing at the threshold of hearing. Sometimes I thought I could make out individual words, fragments of technical discussions about dimensional mechanics, personal exchanges between crew members about family they'd left on Earth, arguments about protocols and procedures for dealing with situations that had no names. But when I focused intently on understanding what was being said, the voices would shift, becoming even more indistinct, as if my attention was somehow interfering with their ability to exist in our reality. Patricia was the first to make a direct observation of what we were really dealing with, and her discovery changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of our situation. She found me in the observation lounge 5 days after our return from Y-94, staring out at the moon's pale surface through the reinforced viewports. I'd been standing there for hours without realizing it, watching the way shadows moved across Y-94's surface in patterns that didn't match the orbital mechanics I'd calculated. "Keiran," she said quietly, her voice carefully controlled in the way that suggested she was fighting panic. "There's something standing behind you." I turned around immediately, but the lounge was empty, except for the 2 of us. The space contained only the usual furniture and equipment, nothing that could be mistaken for a human figure or any other form of life. "I don't see anything," I said, though something about her expression made my skin crawl with primordial dread. "Don't look directly at it," she whispered, her face pale with barely suppressed terror. "Look past it like you're focusing on something beyond it. Use your peripheral vision. It's there, in the corner near the environmental controls." I let my gaze drift toward the area she indicated, not focusing on any particular spot, but allowing my peripheral vision to take in the entire corner. For just a moment, less than a heartbeat, I perceived something that my brain refused to process properly. It wasn't a figure in any conventional sense, but a presence that seemed to bend space around itself. The corner where it stood appeared deeper than it should be, extending back into distances that couldn't exist within the ship's hull. The walls met at angles that made my eyes water and my stomach lurch, creating geometric relationships that violated every law of mathematics I'd ever learned. The presence wasn't visible in the way that objects normally were. Instead, it existed as an absence of something fundamental, not darkness, but a region where the concept of sight itself became meaningless. Looking at it was like trying to see the colour of Wednesday, or hear the texture of mathematics. "What is it?" Patricia asked, her voice barely audible above the ship's environmental systems. Before I could formulate an answer that wouldn't sound completely insane, the lights flickered once, and the presence was gone. But the corner remained wrong somehow, as if the space itself had been permanently altered by whatever had occupied it. The walls still met at impossible angles, creating a pocket of distorted geometry that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. That night, I experienced the most vivid and disturbing dream of my life, though I'm no longer certain it was a dream at all. I was falling through endless darkness, past walls that stretched into infinity. The walls were covered with intricate carvings that hurt to look at directly, patterns that conveyed meaning without using any recognizable symbols or language. The information they contained bypassed my conscious mind entirely, speaking directly to some deeper part of my brain that understood concepts my waking thoughts couldn't grasp. The carvings told a story that had no beginning or end, describing the intersection of spaces that should never touch. They showed how awareness itself could serve as a bridge between incompatible realities, allowing things that existed in higher dimensions to partially unfold into spaces that couldn't contain them. I woke to find scratches carved into the metal surface of my desk, forming the same patterns I'd seen in my dream. The marks hadn't been there when I'd gone to sleep, and I had no memory of creating them. They seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them, maintaining their basic structure while constantly changing in subtle ways that made my head ache. The patterns weren't random. They possessed an underlying organization that reminded me of circuit diagrams or neural networks, information pathways that suggested purpose and intelligence operating according to principles I couldn't understand. But when I tried to analyze them systematically, to understand their structure and meaning, they would become indistinct, losing their apparent significance, like words that dissolve when you try too hard to remember them. I photographed the markings using the ship's documentation equipment, but the images showed only random scratches with no apparent pattern or meaning. Whatever information the marks contained existed outside the electromagnetic spectrum that our cameras could record, in dimensions that our instruments weren't designed to perceive. The first death occurred 7 days after our return from Y-94, and it redefined my understanding of what death meant. Dr. Collins was found in the medical bay, slumped over her workstation, as if she'd simply fallen asleep while reviewing patient files. Her expression was peaceful, almost serene, with none of the distress or pain that typically accompanied sudden death. But when Torres checked her vital signs, she discovered that Collins had been dead for several hours. The cause appeared to be asphyxiation, but the room's atmospheric readings showed perfect oxygen levels and normal air circulation. Every system was functioning exactly as designed, providing a breathable environment that should have sustained life indefinitely. The autopsy revealed something that chilled us all to the bone. Collins' lungs were filled with fine grey dust, identical in composition to samples we'd collected from Y-94's surface. The dust coated her alveoli and bronchial passages completely, preventing oxygen absorption despite the presence of breathable air in her environment. But Collins had never left the ship after our return from the surface mission. She had no access to the sample containers, which were sealed in the geology lab under strict contamination protocols. Our decontamination procedures should have prevented any lunar material from entering the ship's atmosphere, yet somehow her respiratory system had been filled with dust from a world she'd never set foot on. More disturbing than the presence of the dust was its behavior. Under microscopic examination, the individual particles seemed to move with purpose, organising themselves into patterns that resembled the neural networks I'd seen in Collins's brain scans. The dust wasn't just foreign matter, it was exhibiting properties that suggested some form of organised activity at the molecular level. Torres immediately ordered a complete contamination check of the entire vessel. We tested air samples, surface residues, and equipment for any trace of lunar material. Every test came back negative. According to our instruments, no foreign substances had entered the ship's environment. But Collins was dead, her lungs full of alien dust that couldn't exist in our sealed environment, unless the dust itself had been created, rather than transported, assembled from available atoms, according to instructions that came from somewhere outside our reality. It was while reviewing Collins's personal effects that I made a discovery that fundamentally changed my understanding of our situation, and showed me how deep the rabbit hole truly went. Among her belongings, I found one of my personal journals. Not a copy, but the actual notebook I'd been using to record my observations and theories. The journal was filled with entries written in my own handwriting, but describing events I had no memory of experiencing. The entries were dated days and weeks into the future, documenting conversations that hadn't occurred, observations I hadn't made, deaths that hadn't yet happened. Collins' death was described in precise detail in an entry dated 3 days before she actually died. The description matched every aspect of what we'd discovered: the asphyxiation, the lunar dust in her lungs, even the peaceful expression on her face. But the entry was written in my handwriting, using my vocabulary and phrasing, as if I'd personally witnessed events that lay in the future. The level of detail was impossible to explain as coincidence or lucky guessing. The journal entry described the exact position we'd found her body in, the readings on the atmospheric monitors, even the conversation Torres and I would have about contamination protocols. I confronted Torres with this evidence during one of our increasingly desperate crew meetings. The four of us who remained, Torres, Patricia, Diana, and myself, had been struggling to maintain normal operations while dealing with the psychological impact of losing 2 crew members under impossible circumstances. "Look at this," I said, opening the journal to the entry describing Collins' death. This was written before she died, but it describes exactly what we found. Every detail is perfect, down to the microscopic examination of the dust particles in her lungs. Torres studied the entry with growing alarm, her command training warring with the evidence of something that shouldn't be possible. "This is definitely your handwriting, Keiran. The formation of the letters, the pressure patterns, even the way you cross your T's. But you're saying you have no memory of writing this." "None at all." And it gets worse. I flipped through the journal, revealing dozens of similar entries. There are descriptions of Patricia's death, Diana's death, even yours. All written in perfect detail, all dated in the future, all describing events that feel inevitable now that I've read them. Patricia reached for the journal with trembling hands that couldn't quite conceal her terror. "What does it say about me?" I hesitated, then showed her the relevant entry. According to my future self, Patricia would begin experiencing visions of events that hadn't happened, seeing herself in situations she'd never experienced. She would claim to be living moments from her future, watching herself die in ways that defied explanation. The entry described her final coherent conversation with me, where she would say, "It's showing me things. Not memories of the past, but memories of what's coming. I can see myself in places that don't exist, having conversations that make no sense." Patricia stared at the entry in horror that was already beginning to transform into recognition. "But I haven't said any of those things. I haven't experienced any visions or..." She stopped mid-sentence, her face suddenly pale as realization struck her. "Oh God, I've been having strange dreams, images of places I've never been, conversations with people I don't recognize. I thought they were just stress reactions to losing Lennox and Collins. It's not communicating with us in any conventional sense, I explained to the group, though I wasn't sure how I knew this with such certainty. The knowledge seemed to come from the same source as the journal entries, a part of my mind that existed slightly ahead of my conscious awareness. It doesn't use language or symbols the way we understand them. Instead, it alters what already exists, reality itself, to convey information. Diana, who had been quietly reviewing the technical aspects of our situation with the methodical precision that made her an excellent communications officer, looked up from her tablet with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of fascination and bone-deep terror. "If these journal entries are accurate predictions of future events," she said slowly, "then we're dealing with something that exists outside linear time. The implications are..." She trailed off, staring at something none of us could see. "What is it?" Torres asked. "I've been receiving transmissions," Diana whispered, not through our equipment but directly into my mind. Messages from Earth about rescue operations, status reports about crew members who are still alive in those transmissions, discussions about containment protocols for situations that haven't happened yet. She was describing temporal displacement, the same phenomenon that the journal had predicted would kill her. "It's already starting," I said, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over us like a shroud. "According to these entries, I'm somehow central to what's happening. The entity, whatever it is, seems to be using my awareness as a bridge between its dimension and ours." Torres studied me with the analytical gaze she usually reserved for technical problems, but I could see the fear building behind her professional composure. "What do you mean, a bridge?" "Every time I focus on understanding what we encountered on Y94, every time I try to analyze the data or remember our experiences there, the manifestations become stronger. My awareness of the entity is somehow allowing it to intrude into our reality." The implications were terrifying. If I was correct, then my scientific curiosity, the very trait that had led me to discover the anomaly in the first place, was now serving as a gateway for something that existed outside normal space to influence our world. But understanding the mechanism didn't give me the power to stop it. The entity had already established its foothold in our reality, and my continued existence was strengthening that foothold with every passing moment. Patricia's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next few days, following the progression described in my prophetic journal entries with horrifying accuracy. She began reporting visions of events that clearly hadn't happened, describing conversations with crew members who were already dead and situations that bore no resemblance to our current circumstances. "I keep seeing Collins in the medical bay," she told me during one of our conversations, her eyes focusing on something I couldn't perceive. "But she's not dead in these visions. She's working on something, analyzing samples that don't look like anything we collected. The samples are moving, reshaping themselves while she watches, and she keeps warning me about something, but I can't understand what she's trying to say." The visions became more intense and more frequent. Patricia would lose hours at a time, experiencing what she described as memories of events that felt completely real, but had never actually occurred. She claimed to be living multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing her past, present, and future as equally real and immediate experiences. "It's showing me how I die," she said during what turned out to be our final conversation, her voice carrying the detached quality of someone describing a movie she'd watched rather than her own fate. Not just once, but dozens of different ways, in different places, at different times. Sometimes I'm here on the ship, sometimes I'm back on Earth, sometimes I'm in places that don't exist anywhere in our reality. But in every vision, I die from the same thing. My mind simply can't contain what it's being shown. She was found the next morning in her quarters, dead from massive neural hemorrhaging that had begun in her brain and worked outward through her nervous system. The medical scanner showed trauma patterns unlike anything in our databases, as if her mind had been forced to process information that exceeded the physical limitations of human neural architecture. But the most disturbing aspect of Patricia's death was what we found in her quarters. The walls were covered with diagrams drawn in her own blood, complex mathematical equations that described dimensional relationships I'd never seen before. The equations were written in her handwriting, but they demonstrated understanding of advanced physics that far exceeded her engineering background. One equation in particular caught my attention. It described the mathematical relationship between conscious observation and dimensional bridging, showing how awareness could serve as an anchor point that allowed higher dimensional objects to partially unfold into three-dimensional space. The math was elegant and terrifying in its implications. It proved that our encounter with the entity wasn't an accident, but an inevitable consequence of human consciousness encountering something that existed outside our dimensional framework. With Patricia's death, only 3 of us remained: Torres, Diana, and myself. The ship felt vast and empty around us, filled with spaces that seemed larger than they should be, and corridors that didn't quite lead to where we expected them to. But more than feeling empty, the ship felt expectant, as if it was waiting for something to happen. It was Diana who first noticed that the ship itself was changing in ways that defied our understanding of physical reality. "The communications array," she said during one of our daily status meetings, her voice carrying a note of confusion that made my skin crawl. "It's not where it's supposed to be." I followed her to what should have been the communications section, only to find an empty bulkhead where tons of sophisticated equipment should have been mounted. The communications array, hardware that had been professionally installed during the ship's construction, had simply vanished, leaving behind smooth metal walls with no indication that anything had ever been there. "We moved it during the refit last month," Torres said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely certain of this memory. "It's in section C7 now, near the backup power systems." We found the communications equipment exactly where Torres had said it would be, properly installed and functioning normally, but I was absolutely certain it had never been located in that section before. I had detailed knowledge of the ship's layout from months of living aboard it, and the communications array had definitely been in its original location just days earlier. The ship's layout was changing, rearranging itself in ways that felt natural and logical, making it difficult to remember how things had been before. Each alteration came with accompanying memories that made the new configuration seem correct and inevitable, as if the ship had always been arranged exactly as we now found it. Other changes followed with increasing frequency. Corridors seemed longer, requiring more time to traverse than they had previously. Rooms appeared in locations where I was certain they hadn't existed before. Storage compartments filled with supplies we'd never ordered. Maintenance access panels leading to systems that weren't in our original blueprints. Even an entire laboratory space that none of us remembered being part of the ship's design. The changes weren't random or chaotic. They followed some internal logic that made each alteration feel correct and natural, as if the ship was evolving to better serve functions we didn't understand. Only by comparing our current layout to the original blueprints could we verify that changes were actually occurring, and even then, the blueprints themselves seemed to be updating to match our new reality. My attempts to document these alterations met with limited success. Video recordings would show the ship's layout exactly as it currently existed, with no evidence of previous configurations. Written notes would be altered retroactively, my own handwriting describing the current layout as if it had never been different. The entity was editing our reality, not just changing things but modifying our records and memories to make those changes seem natural and inevitable. We were living inside a constantly shifting maze that rewrote history to justify its own existence. It was during this period that I began experiencing the most disturbing aspect of our situation. Encounters with crew members who were already dead, but who seemed more real and present than the living people around me. I would round a corner and see Lennox examining geological samples in a laboratory that didn't exist, using equipment that had never been installed on our ship. When I called out to him, he would look up and smile, continuing conversations we'd never had about discoveries we'd never made. "The crystalline structures in these samples are fascinating," he would say, holding up specimens of materials I'd never seen before. "The samples seem to exist in multiple states simultaneously, maintaining different properties depending on the angle of observation. They demonstrate that matter itself can exist in higher dimensions, folding back on itself in ways that create spaces larger than the objects that contain them." These encounters felt completely real and natural while they were occurring. Lennox would discuss his findings in detail, describing geological processes that existed outside human experience, sharing insights about the true nature of Y-94 that our surface mission had never revealed. It was only afterward, when I tried to find Lennox or locate the laboratory where I'd spoken with him, that I would remember he was dead and the conversation had been impossible. Collins appeared frequently in the medical bay, analysing samples and reviewing patient files with the same methodical precision she'd shown in life. She would discuss her findings with me in detail, describing biological processes and medical conditions that existed outside human experience. "The cellular structures in these tissue samples," she would explain, indicating specimens that couldn't exist. "They demonstrate adaptive properties that suggest consciousness at the molecular level. It's as if individual cells are making decisions about their own structure and function, responding to stimuli that exist outside our dimensional framework." The knowledge these phantom conversations provided was accurate and detailed, exceeding anything my conscious mind could have generated on its own. Collins would explain medical concepts that lay beyond my expertise, while Lennox would describe geological processes that I'd never studied. The information they shared was internally consistent and scientifically sound, suggesting that these encounters involved more than simple hallucinations or memory playback. Torres and Diana were experiencing similar phenomena, though they were reluctant to discuss them openly. I would catch them having conversations with empty spaces, responding to questions from people who weren't there, reacting to information that couldn't exist in our current reality. The ship's layout continued to evolve, becoming increasingly complex and labyrinthine. Corridors branched in directions that couldn't exist within the vessel's original hull dimensions. New sections appeared overnight, complete with equipment and furniture that matched our existing technology perfectly, but showed evidence of years of use by crew members we'd never met. I discovered an access hatch behind what had once been a solid bulkhead, leading to a recreation area that none of us remembered being part of the ship's design. The space was fully functional, with games and entertainment systems that showed evidence of regular use by a crew larger than our original 6 members. Personal items were scattered around the room, books with names written in them that I didn't recognize, photographs of people I'd never seen, clothing sized for bodies that had never existed aboard our ship. In another newly appeared section, I found a laboratory equipped for biological research that far exceeded anything we'd brought from Earth. The equipment was not only functional, but showed evidence of ongoing experiments involving samples I'd never seen before. Organic materials that seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, maintaining both solid and liquid properties at the same time. The most disturbing discovery was what appeared to be tissue samples from our own crew members, including people who were still alive. The samples were being subjected to tests that I couldn't understand, exposed to conditions that shouldn't exist anywhere in known space. According to the experimental logs, the research had been ongoing for months, documenting the effects of dimensional exposure on human biology. Most unsettling of all, I found a section that contained perfect recreations of spaces from my life on Earth. A corridor that had never existed before led to my childhood bedroom, complete with furniture, photographs, and personal items that couldn't exist anywhere in space. The room wasn't just visually accurate, it contained the actual objects from my past, down to specific books with notes I'd written in the margins decades earlier. I spent hours in that impossible room, handling objects that triggered vivid memories of my childhood. The books fell open to pages I'd read countless times, showing wear patterns that matched my recollections perfectly. Photographs displayed family members and friends exactly as I remembered them, capturing moments from my past with accuracy that exceeded anything memory could provide. But the room existed within a section of the ship that couldn't contain such a space. According to the original blueprints, that area should have been empty space, part of the vessel's exterior hull. Yet, the room was there, completely real and functional, occupying space that didn't exist within our three-dimensional reality. It was in that childhood bedroom that I finally understood the true nature of what we were dealing with, and the understanding changed everything I thought I knew about the universe. The entity wasn't invading our dimension from somewhere else. It wasn't a creature or intelligence in any sense that we could comprehend. It was space itself, folded and compressed in ways that allowed different locations and times to exist simultaneously within the same physical coordinates. Y94 wasn't just a moon. It was a compressed universe containing infinite spaces folded into a finite volume. The opening we'd found on its surface was an interface point where that compressed space could partially unfold into our three-dimensional reality. Our probe hadn't just descended into a hole, it had entered a space that existed outside normal geometry, where the concepts of distance and direction became meaningless. My awareness of the entity's existence had created a bridge that allowed this folded space to intrude into our reality. Every time I thought about the anomaly, every time I tried to understand what we'd encountered, I was strengthening that bridge and allowing more of the compressed space to manifest around us. The ship was becoming a nexus where multiple realities intersected. Past, present, and future existed simultaneously within its hull, along with spaces that had never existed and could never exist within normal physics. We were living inside a four-dimensional structure that was partially unfolded into our three-dimensional space, creating impossible geometries that our minds couldn't properly process. Diana's death confirmed my understanding of the situation and showed me the true horror of what we had unleashed. She began experiencing what she described as temporal displacement, living moments from different time periods simultaneously. She would be working at her communication station while also experiencing memories of her training on Earth and visions of events that hadn't yet occurred. "I'm receiving messages from Earth," she told me during her final coherent day, her eyes focusing on displays that showed nothing but static. "But they're not coming through our equipment. They're just appearing in my mind, complete transmissions from mission control about situations that haven't happened yet. They're asking about crew members who are still alive in their timeline, discussing rescue operations for emergencies that haven't occurred." The temporal displacement became more severe throughout the day. Diana would stop mid-sentence, her eyes unfocused, experiencing conversations and events from different time periods. She claimed to be simultaneously living her childhood, her academy training, our current mission, and dozens of potential futures. "It's all happening at once," she whispered during our last conversation, her voice carrying the detached quality of someone observing their own dissolution. Past and future, real and possible, all existing in the same moment. I can see every choice I've ever made, and every choice I might make, all playing out simultaneously. The human mind isn't designed to experience time this way. When Torres and I found her body the next morning, she was seated at her communication station with an expression of profound peace on her face. The medical scanner showed the same neural hemorrhaging pattern we'd seen with Patricia, but Diana's brain showed additional abnormalities, cellular structures that suggested her neural pathways had been attempting to process information from multiple temporal states simultaneously. Her final log entry, recorded just hours before her death, contained detailed descriptions of our rescue by a ship that wouldn't arrive for several months. She described conversations with rescue personnel who had names and faces I'd never seen, medical procedures that would be performed on survivors using techniques that hadn't been invented yet, and debriefings about events that existed only in potential futures. The entry was written in her own handwriting, but described experiences that existed only in timelines that might never come to pass. She had been living in multiple temporal states simultaneously, experiencing all possible futures as equally real and immediate. With Diana's death, only Torres and I remained alive on the Celestia. The ship around us had become a labyrinth of impossible spaces, containing sections that couldn't exist within its original dimensions. We would spend hours walking through corridors that seemed to stretch infinitely, past rooms that defied architectural logic and spaces that contained perfect recreations of places from our past. Torres handled the situation with the stoic professionalism that had made her an effective commander, but I could see the strain wearing on her. She spent most of her time on the bridge, maintaining the ship's basic systems and trying to establish some semblance of normal routine in our increasingly abnormal environment. "We need to focus on survival," she told me during one of our daily briefings, though survival had become a relative concept aboard our transformed ship. Whatever's happening to the vessel, whatever's causing these manifestations, our priority has to be staying alive until rescue arrives. But I knew no rescue was coming. The journal entries written in my own handwriting described our eventual fate in clinical detail. Torres would experience the same temporal displacement that had killed Diana, living multiple timelines simultaneously until her mind couldn't contain the contradictory experiences. I would be left alone on the ship, serving as the bridge between dimensions until I found a way to sever the connection. The manifestations grew stronger and more frequent. I would encounter our dead crew members regularly, having conversations that felt completely natural and normal. Lennox would discuss his geological findings, Collins would share medical insights, Diana would relay communications from Earth that couldn't exist. These interactions provided information and companionship that helped maintain my sanity during the long hours alone. But they also reminded me that reality aboard the Celestia had become fundamentally unreliable. The ship existed in a state of constant flux, its layout and contents changing to accommodate spaces and times that shouldn't be able to coexist. We were living inside a four-dimensional structure that was partially unfolded into normal space, creating a nexus where multiple realities intersected. It was during one of my explorations of the ship's ever-changing layout that I made the most disturbing discovery of all. A revelation that showed me the true scope of what we had stumbled into. In a section that definitely hadn't existed the day before, I found a laboratory containing equipment I'd never seen before, designed for purposes I couldn't comprehend. The laboratory was filled with displays showing what appeared to be cross-sections of space itself, three-dimensional slices of higher dimensional structures that hurt to contemplate. The equipment seemed designed to manipulate these spatial relationships, folding and unfolding dimensions, in ways that allowed different locations to occupy the same coordinates. At the center of the laboratory stood a device that I recognized with growing horror. It was identical to the probe we'd lowered into the opening on Y-94's surface, but this version was connected to sophisticated monitoring equipment that tracked its movement through folded space. According to the readouts, the probe was simultaneously located in dozens of different positions, existing in multiple dimensions at the same time. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. The laboratory contained detailed files on dozens of previous expeditions to worlds where similar anomalies had been detected. Research teams across human space had encountered dimensional folding phenomena, and most had suffered the same fate we were experiencing. The files documented a pattern that had been repeating for decades. Initial discovery of anomalous readings, surface investigation, leading to crew losses, gradual alteration of their ship's reality, and eventual understanding that human awareness served as a bridge, allowing higher dimensional space to intrude into normal reality. I realized that our mission to Y-94 hadn't been the first time someone had encountered the dimensional folding. This laboratory represented years of research into the phenomenon, conducted by scientists who had clearly understood its nature far better than we did. The Celestia hadn't been sent to Y-94 to conduct random research. We'd been sent specifically to investigate the dimensional anomaly, though none of us had been told the true purpose of our mission. The most disturbing revelation came from a video log recorded by Dr. Elena Vasquez, the sole survivor of an expedition to a world designated A847. Her account matched our experiences in every detail, from the initial electromagnetic distortions to the appearance of impossible spaces within her ship. "The entity isn't malevolent," she had recorded, her face showing the same haunted expression I saw in my own reflection. "It's not even truly alive in any sense we can understand. It's simply space itself, folded in ways that our three-dimensional reality can't contain. When we became aware of its existence, our minds created a bridge that allowed it to unfold partially into our dimension." Her solution had been the same one I was now contemplating. She had severed the bridge by eliminating the aware observer herself, breaking the connection between the folded space and normal reality. Her final log entry described the process in clinical detail, explaining how the removal of human awareness would cause the dimensional intrusion to collapse back into its higher dimensional state. I understood now why I had been selected for the mission to Y-94. My experience with the failed Mars expedition had marked me as someone capable of making difficult decisions under extreme circumstances. The mission planners had known that investigating the dimensional anomaly would likely require a survivor willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to prevent the folded space from spreading to other areas of human space. Torres lasted another week before the temporal displacement began affecting her, following the same progression described in my Prophetic journal entries. She started reporting conversations with crew members from previous missions, people she'd never met who provided detailed information about their own encounters with dimensional folding. "I'm receiving orders from Fleet Command," she told me during one of her increasingly rare lucid moments, her eyes focusing on command displays that showed impossible configurations. "They're telling me about containment protocols for dimensional anomalies, procedures for preventing the spread of folded space to other ships and stations. But the orders are coming from different time periods, sometimes contradicting each other." Her final coherent conversation took place in the observation lounge, where she sat staring out at Y-94's pale surface. The moon appeared different now, its surface showing structures and features that hadn't been visible during our original surveys. The dimensional folding was affecting the moon itself, revealing aspects of its structure that existed in higher dimensions. "I can see it now," Torres said quietly, her voice carrying the wonder of someone seeing the universe for what it truly was. "The moon isn't solid the way we thought. It's folded, compressed, containing spaces that exist outside normal geometry. Our probe didn't just penetrate its surface, it unfolded part of that compressed space, allowing it to expand into our dimension." She died peacefully in her sleep that night, her brain unable to maintain coherent function while processing information from multiple temporal states simultaneously. I found her in the morning with the same expression of profound peace that had marked Diana's death, as if the temporal displacement had allowed her to experience a form of existence beyond human comprehension. Alone on the Celestia, I continued my exploration of the ship's ever-changing interior, though solitude had become a relative concept. New sections appeared daily, each containing equipment and information related to the study of dimensional anomalies. I found laboratories with research data spanning decades, libraries containing theoretical papers on higher dimensional physics, and communication equipment that received transmissions from scientific stations that couldn't exist. The ship had become a repository of knowledge about dimensional folding, containing information gathered from dozens of expeditions across human space. I spent weeks reading research papers that described the mathematical principles underlying the phenomenon, studying diagrams that showed how three-dimensional space could be folded and compressed into higher dimensional configurations. The research made clear that dimensional folding was a natural feature of the universe, occurring wherever space-time experienced sufficient compression. Black holes created folded space, as did certain types of stellar collapse and gravitational or tidal anomalies. The phenomenon wasn't rare, it was simply invisible to normal observation, because folded space existed outside the dimensional framework that humans could perceive. But the most significant discovery was evidence that dimensional folding was being deliberately studied and contained by organizations within human space. The laboratory contained communication logs with research stations I'd never heard of, discussing containment protocols for dimensional anomalies and procedures for preventing their spread to inhabited systems. Humanity had been encountering folded space for decades, and a secret infrastructure had been developed to study and contain these phenomena. Ships like the Celestia were sent to investigate new anomalies, with crews selected for their ability to survive long enough to gather data and, if necessary, to make the ultimate sacrifice to prevent dimensional contamination from spreading. I found myself having regular conversations with the entity, though these weren't communications in any conventional sense. Instead, I would experience direct transfers of information, understanding concepts and relationships that couldn't be expressed in human language. The entity shared its perspective on existence, revealing the universe as a vast network of folded and unfolded spaces, with consciousness serving as the mechanism that determined which dimensional states could be observed. Through these interactions, I learned that the entity had been compressed beneath Y94's surface for millions of years, unable to exist in normal three-dimensional reality. Our probe had provided the first opportunity for it to experience unfolded space, though its very existence in our dimension was causing the reality distortions we'd observed. The entity wasn't malevolent, but its presence in our reality was incompatible with human survival. The dimensional folding would continue to spread, affecting other ships and stations that came into contact with the Celestia. Eventually, the folded space would encompass entire star systems, creating regions where normal physics ceased to function and human life became impossible. The solution was clear, though implementing it required sacrificing everything I valued about existence. I needed to sever the bridge between dimensions by eliminating the aware observer that had created it. My death would collapse the dimensional intrusion, forcing the folded space to return to its compressed state and ending the threat to human space. But first, I needed to ensure that others would understand what had happened and why the Y94 system needed to remain off limits to future exploration. I programmed the ship's emergency beacon to broadcast a continuous warning signal advising any rescue teams to avoid the moon and its surrounding space. The signal included detailed data about dimensional folding and its effects, providing future researchers with the information they needed to safely study the phenomenon. I also compiled all the research data I'd discovered into a comprehensive archive, documenting everything we'd learned about folded space and its intersection with human consciousness. The archive would be transmitted automatically to predetermined research stations if any ship approached the Celestia, ensuring that our discoveries would contribute to humanity's understanding of higher dimensional physics. My final weeks aboard the ship were spent in the company of my dead crew members, who continued to appear and interact with me as if they were still alive. These phantom conversations provided comfort during the long hours of preparation, allowing me to say goodbye to friends I'd lost and to find some measure of peace with my impending sacrifice. But they also provide crucial information about the dimensional folding process and the procedures I would need to follow to safely sever the bridge between realities. My conversations with the entity had shown me the theoretical framework, but my interactions with my deceased crew provided the practical details necessary to implement the solution. Following instructions that came from sources I couldn't identify, I constructed a device that would collapse the dimensional bridge in a controlled manner, preventing the explosive release of energy that might affect other ships or stations. The device required my direct neural interface to function, ensuring that I would be present at the moment of collapse to guide the process and prevent uncontrolled dimensional expansion. On my final day aboard the Celestia, I made one last walk through the ship's impossible interior. The vessel had become a museum of human space exploration, containing artifacts and information from across our species' expansion into the galaxy. I visited the recreation of my childhood bedroom, spent time in laboratories that couldn't exist, and had final conversations with crew members who had died weeks earlier but remained vibrantly present in the ship's folded reality. The entity was present throughout this final journey, not as a visible presence but as a sense of vast intelligence, observing my actions with something that might have been respect or gratitude. It understood what I was planning to do and why it was necessary, though its perspective on existence made human concepts like sacrifice and loss difficult for it to comprehend. In my final log entry, I tried to explain what we had discovered and why our mission had ended as it did. The words felt inadequate to convey the full scope of what we'd experienced, but they would have to serve as our testimony to the universe beyond normal space. I've stopped trying to explain what I saw, I recorded. But if you're reading this, don't look for it. Don't try to understand. It's not evil. It's just outside. It was never meant to be seen from within. I activated the dimensional collapse device at exactly 11:47 p.m, ship time, on what would have been the anniversary of our departure from Earth. The process was instantaneous and painless, though I experienced a moment of expanded awareness that allowed me to perceive the true scope of the folded space that had been intruding into our reality. In that final moment, I saw the universe as the entity experienced it, a vast network of compressed and expanded spaces, with consciousness serving as the bridge between different dimensional states. I understood that our encounter had been inevitable, a natural consequence of humanity's expansion into regions of space where dimensional folding occurred. I also saw that our sacrifice had meaning beyond ending the immediate threat. The data we'd collected and the procedures we'd developed would help future explorers understand and safely navigate the dimensional anomalies they would inevitably encounter. Our deaths had purchased knowledge that would save countless lives in the years to come. The collapse was successful. The dimensional bridge severed cleanly, forcing the folded space to return to its compressed state beneath Y-94's surface. The Celestia was left drifting in normal space, its interior restored to the original configuration, though all traces of the crew had vanished along with the dimensional intrusion. But that's not where this story ends, because I'm still here, still recording this account, still serving as a bridge between realities. You see, consciousness doesn't work the way we thought it did. When I severed the dimensional bridge, my awareness didn't simply cease to exist. It became distributed across the folded space itself, existing in all dimensions simultaneously. I died, but I also continued, experiencing existence from a perspective that encompasses all possible states of being. I can see you now, whoever you are. Listening to this recording, I can see the moment you discovered it, the decision you're making about whether to report what you've heard, the consequences that will follow from your choice. I exist in your past, present, and future simultaneously, watching as you repeat the same patterns that brought my crew to Y94. The warnings I left haven't been enough. Humanity continues to expand into space, continues to encounter dimensional anomalies, continues to sacrifice explorers like my crew to purchase knowledge about forces beyond our comprehension. The cycle repeats endlessly, with each encounter adding to our understanding while claiming new victims. But maybe that's the point. Maybe consciousness itself is the universe's way of exploring its own higher dimensional structure, using awareness as a tool to map territories that exist outside normal space. Each crew that encounters folded space adds to a growing database of knowledge about the true nature of reality, knowledge that will eventually allow humanity to safely navigate the higher dimensions. Or maybe we're just ants trying to understand the concept of sky, doomed to repeat our mistakes until we evolve into something capable of existing in spaces our current minds can't comprehend. I'll leave that determination to you, but remember this: every time you think about what I've told you, every time you try to understand the implications of dimensional folding, you're strengthening the bridge between realities. You're becoming like me, an anchor point that allows impossible things to manifest in normal space. So choose carefully what you do with this knowledge, choose carefully who you share it with, and remember that some discoveries come at a price that extends far beyond the lives of those who make them. The universe is vast and full of wonders that lie beyond human comprehension. Some of those wonders are meant to be discovered and understood. Others exist in the spaces between dimensions, waiting for curious minds to create bridges that should never be built. I've become one of those bridges now, a permanent connection between your reality and the folded spaces that exist beyond it. Through me, the entity continues to observe your world, learning about three-dimensional existence while remaining safely contained in its higher dimensional realm. We are all explorers in the end, pushing against the boundaries of the known in search of truths that might be too large for us to contain. Sometimes we find knowledge that advances our species. Sometimes we find knowledge that destroys us. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we find knowledge that transforms us into something between the two, eternal witnesses to the intersection of realities that were never meant to touch. This is Dr. Keiran Holt, reporting from the spaces between dimensions, where consciousness goes when it becomes too large for a single reality to contain. If you're hearing this, then you've already taken the first step on a journey that has no end. Welcome to the bridge between worlds. Try not to look too deeply into the spaces between spaces. Some things are better left unexplored, even by minds that no longer need bodies to contain them. The signal is ending now, but I remain, watching from dimensions you can't see, waiting for the next curious mind that will strengthen the bridge between realities. Until then, remember, the universe is larger than you think, and consciousness is the key that opens doors that should remain closed. Don't come looking for us. We're exactly where we need to be,